Good day, listeners. My name is Ryan Todd, and I'm your host of Beyond the Checkbox. If you are in HR, you are in people and culture, you're a leader in any organization, and you want more mental health in your organization, this is the podcast for you. Today, we are joined by the esteemed Ann Baynton, who has been anointed the Godmother of Psychological Health and Safety. Ann, in my humble opinion, is the leading consultant in the field of psychological health and safety. She was the co-chair and continues to work with the National Health and Safety Standard for Psychological Health across the country. And thank you, Ann, for joining us today. We are very pleased to have you on the show.
You're welcome. And you just get to be prolific because you live longer than other consultants.
You live long enough to outlast them.
That's right.
How long have you been in this field, actually?
Would have been about 1997, I guess. I had had careers before that as a small business owner. And in 1997, I started to look at workplace mental health through the Canadian Mental Health Association, and then progressed to being an independent consultant.
So 1997, I imagine the conversation was very different than it is today. Take me through, like, in the beginning. I mean, you may have been fighting an uphill battle.
Well, what's interesting is that a friend suggested that I apply for this position. I was fresh out of university at that time. I just had gotten my master's in social policy. And when I went to interview for it, they asked me if I had any experience with workplace mental health. And it wasn't until that very moment that I realized that I had had 8 employees, and 4 of them had a diagnosis of mental illness. But because these were very competent professionals, it never occurred to me that it was a mental illness. It was just a condition that they managed. It didn't affect their work. They were brilliant at work. But it started me on a journey to understand the stigma, the myths, the stereotypes, and that because I was so ignorant, I didn't buy into any of them because my experience was so different.
And at that time, I imagine there was very few. Like, we have Bell Let's Talk now, and we have all these destigma campaigns, and we have the commission doing the excellent destigmatizing work. But at that time, it wasn't really a thing, I imagine. Like, there wasn't the movement.
In fact, CMHA at that time said, we want to go into workplaces and teach employers about mental health. But the way that it had been set up was really, this is depression, this is anxiety, this is PTSD, and these are the symptoms. And I said, do you really think an employer is going to pay you for that? And do you really think it's of any value to them? Are you asking them to become mental health experts? So from a very practical point, I said, no, I think most employers have good intentions. And like me, they're completely ignorant to the situation. So don't tell them what mental illness is. Tell them how to support an employee with it. And so out of that, we developed the Mental Health Works program. But at that time, I would say, people would say, well, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm in workplace mental health. And they would go, oh, that must be really sad. And I'm like, what? And they said, well, you're dealing with those people. And no, I'm dealing with people like us that just happen to have a condition that they have to manage. And it's not sad at all. It's quite uplifting. I really enjoy it, but it was really interesting to understand that nobody understood.
I wonder when you started to see the transition to, like, where we are today. I mean, of course, we have a long ways to go. When I started residency, I still felt like the stigma thing was quite strong. And then in that, like, 5-year, I felt kind of blessed because I was in a really interesting time of especially in North America, and how stigma devolved in that 5 years. When I started, it was, I think, still strong. And then by the end of it, Bell Let's Talk came on line, and things were decreasing. When did you see this shift? And yeah, when did you start to feel things change? Because you were on the front lines. You were seeing the real conversations about stigma.
Yeah, it was very gradual. In my mind, it was almost like a couple people at a time,
Yeah.
couple of organizations at a time. I really believe that the way we get rid of stigma is exposure, or what they say in the literature is contact. So once you know somebody who has a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, and you see the human being and not the label, then stigma starts to go down. But it really wasn't until we were sitting in the room talking about the national standard that we made a conscious decision not to call it a standard on workplace mental health, because that still brought up an automatic thought about mental illness. And we made the decision as a group to use psychological health and safety, so that either people would say, what is that? Or they would connect it with health and safety in general, which is the employer's responsibility to have a safe workplace and do no harm. So that came about because it was my experience in helping employees return to work or stay at work with a mental illness, that there was a huge difference between some workplaces and others. At the time, I didn't really have the label for it then. I now know it's the difference between a psychologically safe workplace and a psychologically unsafe workplace. Accommodating, meaning helping someone do their job in spite of the illness, is so much easier in a psychologically safe workplace. In a psychologically unsafe workplace, it's really hard to tell who has a diagnosis and who doesn't, because so many people are stressed out. So many people have repetitive negative thoughts. So many people are dealing with motivation issues, performance issues, conflict issues, because the workplace creates that toxicity. In a psychologically safe workplace, the individual who may be unwell, it becomes clear that it's their personal wellness and not the workplace, in a much easier way.
So that term, psychological health and safety, that was you guys. That's where it came from.
Yeah, it was when we were talking about the development of the standard, and that this term really denotes something different than what people would think if you said a mentally healthy workplace.
That's powerful because, as we know, marketing and branding is so important, and branding that changed the conversation really. And I actually didn't know that that's where the term was generated from, and that's really cool to hear that story. The standard, I'm interested to know how that all came together. It's probably not an easy story to tell. But there's 35 people on the committee. There's 4 organizations. It takes multiple years. Like, how does something like that come about even? Who says, yeah, we got to do this? And then what's step 2? It's such a, yeah. Tell me how that came about.
So a doctor, a lawyer, and a social worker walked into a bar. They sat down, they all ordered a beer, and this is how the conversation went. The doctor said, patients are more and more presenting with stress-related illnesses. And even after we treat them, when they return to the workplace, they relapse because the stress there is so great that it's no longer just a personal issue. And the lawyers said employers are increasingly getting sued for the damage that is done to the mental health of their employees. And these employers keep saying, well, what can I do to prevent these litigation or grievances or complaints or claims? And the social worker said, yeah, this is tough. And we really need to help employers understand exactly how to do it and why it's good business. And that really was a conversation with Dr. Ian Arnold, who was at the time the chair of the Workforce Advisory Committee with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and Dr. Martin Shane, who wrote The Perfect Legal Storm, where he told us years before that employers were increasingly going to be held responsible for the damage to the psychological health of employees. And the social worker was me. And we really were in a bar, and we really did
Really?
have a beer. Yes.
It's not just a good joke.
No. And so from there, what is now Canada Life, because I was working as a contractor for them with workplace strategies for mental health, when I told them about this idea that we needed to go beyond Guarding Minds at Work, which still is a free resource, that means it meant that for employers, they could assess psychological health and safety. We were calling it psychosocial factors. They could assess that at no cost or low cost, whereas before it would have been like 6 figures to hire a consultant to create the measurement and then do it. We now had a free resource. We thought that the time was right to take it further, to make it more arm's length from any particular interest group. And that's the consensus basis that the Canadian Standards Association uses. So what is Canada Life now said, that sounds like a great idea. How much money do you need to create this standard? And we said, thank you very much. But we actually think that if an insurance company pays for the standard, it will not have the same credibility as if it was done by a more independent third party. So we really appreciated their generosity, and they did contribute to costs. But Senator Michael Kirby, he spent about a year lobbying different people in the Canadian government, the federal government, until he got the funding for the standard. And that is then at that point. So this is now at least 2 years from our conversation. We got the funding and we were able to go ahead.
So it took some time.
It did take some time.
Yeah, like everything. And the standard right now, as we know it, where have you seen the greatest impact with it? I could tell you some personal stories in the workplace stuff that we do, but what has been the greatest accomplishment of that document and that standard from your perspective?
I really believe more than, and it's funny because you're called Beyond the Checkbox, that the standard could be used as a series of checkboxes. Okay, did that, looked at these things, have this in place. But I don't think that's the value of it. I think the value of it is that it opened up a conversation across the country about, this is something that we should be looking at. This is something that is part of the responsibility of organizations. And based on the, I think it was 43 organization case study that the Mental Health Commission of Canada did, we now know it is good for business to do that, to the bottom line. So it's not just employers being nice, but it is employers being astute and really thinking about what will support success. So opening the conversation, I think, is even more important than actually completing the checkboxes.
And then the standard is quite clear, I think, on that piece where it talks a lot about just getting on the journey. Like, this is not necessarily, you don't have to rip through all 62 points to create the standard, but just get on the road and have iterations of it so that you're continually improving. And the tension I see with the document is, like, in one part it's about the journey, and another part it's a standard. And I imagine that language was used purposefully to have some sort of, I don't want to say compliance type of effort, but to show organizations that this is what we should be accomplishing. I imagine there was some thought around, like, should we make this into law? Is this a compliance document? How did you juggle that kind of tricky state? Because a lot of employers could perceive that as a compliance document where it actually isn't. That I don't think that's the heart and soul of it.
Right. It's definitely stated that it's voluntary guidelines. To be able to say that you've aligned with the standard, there's certain shoulds that are in there. And you're right, we did it the way we did so that really the concrete linear thinkers have a roadmap. The people that are more sort of organic can really just turn around and ask the question, how will this impact the psychological health and safety of employees? And by this, I mean your policies, your processes, your changes, your structure, the way work is assigned. If you just start to look at the question, to think about it for your own situation, you can cover all of the things that are in the standard, but some people that's too vague. And so we really wanted to support all different types of employers and organizations and associations to have what is important to them. And there is still to this day some people who feel that it should be legislated. The challenge with the legislation is that the standard is an ideal to aspire to. If it were to be legislated, it would have to be um, minimized significantly to make it reasonable to be mandatory for everybody. So you'd lose the real value of thinking about the big picture and making it continual improvement if we just nailed it down to the legal requirement.
And what would that look like? I imagine you've given some thought to, like, if this became law, what would the minimum standard be? Like, what if it was a true compliance document? What would that even look like?
My imagination goes to the AODA, the Accessibilities for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is basically saying you must assess risk and remove barriers. So I would think that that's what the psychological health and safety would say. You need to assess the risk to psychological health and safety, and you need to mitigate it, reduce the risk, address it. And it would probably be that vague. But if that's the case, then does it have any teeth to have consequences for noncompliance? How much money would it cost to police that, to monitor it? And there's a lot of challenges with it. I remember Michael Kirby saying, we'll start the parade, we'll prove that this is valuable, and everybody then will want to get in front and lead it, right? And that's what we're finding. One of the things that came up recently is that there's people holding themselves out as psychological health and safety experts, and the act around psychologists says that we can't use that. Now it's a gray area still because people aren't saying they're psychologists, but is saying you're a psychological health and safety expert in contravention of that. So we need to think carefully about who's putting themselves out as experts. And yet, I think everybody should be trying to lead this parade. Everybody should be trying to change workplaces to be psychologically safe for the value and the well-being of all Canadians.
Do, do you see what problems arise from that? Like as I see the Canadian workplace kind of mental health marketplace, there is a couple of groups. There's the experts, the consultants, the kind of one-off speakers, even. There's kind of I would call them arm's length government organizations, Mental Health Commission, the CMHA potentially, and then there's this whole wave of groups that are trying to scale this and make it technologically accessible. That's how I see things, and I see real problems with everyone hanging up a shingle saying, I am the expert, or expert if not the expert. What problems do you see with that arising? Or is it a good thing? Should people be all carrying the torch?
I think that it is the responsibility of anybody who contracts services to do due diligence, to get references, to understand the work that the individual has already done, whether it's an organization or it's an individual. And so I don't want to discourage anybody from breaking into this field. And there was a time, you know, you and I were brand new. And so we don't want to say, don't do it, or only these people should be allowed. I think you should do it, but it's up to the employers or whoever hires us to make sure that we're credible, that we will do what they think we're going to do, and have the ability to deliver on it.
And do you see a time when things get down to the minimal compliance standard? Like, do you predict that there will be a time when there is legislation to say we need to meet this basic standard? Like, like we have Bill C-30 in Alberta, you know, the AODA. They're touching on it, but is it ever going to become law?
And this is the work that Dr. Martin Shane has done over decades now, is there's absolutely a trend to the evolution of the laws that hold employers responsible. So there is no doubt that employers are going to be increasingly held responsible to do no harm to employees. What that looks like, I don't have the ability to guess, but I definitely can see that it is evolving. And it's like all laws, right? We have pendulums that swing and then they go, that's a little too onerous, and maybe we'll adjust it back a bit. I personally want employers to do this because it is just good business sense. If you want to attract and retrain, somebody said a statistic yesterday that by 2025, 75% of our workforce will be millennials. Well, I gave birth to and raised millennials, and they won't take the kind of stuff that we took, blind obedience, or having somebody screaming at us and just going, you know, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. They're not going to do it. So they're going to revolutionize the workplace not because they're entitled, but because they were raised to expect respect. And they would assume that that's what will happen, is that there will be respect in the workplace. So I'm hopeful that they're going to revolutionize it anyways.
That's that's a great jumping point for like where the standard goes next. It was reaffirmed in 2018. Is there thoughts on kind of on the future of it? Is it I imagine the committee and yourself, that you're working on kind of next iterations and how we adapt it. What's the future of the standard?
So all standards through the Canadian Standards group have to be reviewed every 5 years. So it's inevitable, but it also can be opened up beforehand if there's changes in legislation, changes in the economy, the way work is done. And workplaces are just going through a revolution right now. And it's interesting because with what's happening with the spread of this virus, it's causing people to depend more on technology, more on remote working. But right now, we are actually doing changes, updates to Guarding Minds at Work, which was part of the inspiration for the standard. And what we're doing is we're making it more concrete in terms of what each psychosocial factor measures, so there's less overlap, and also what each statement tells the employer so that it's really actionable. Because if you have a statement that's vague, it could be that the employer's not sure. How do I act on this? And while the standard and Guarding Minds at Work says just surveying isn't enough, you need to then take the results back to the employees and ask them why that is, how it could be better. So all of these resources are being updated for June this year. And of course, they're free in English and French. But I'm sure that will have some impact on the standard, just like the folks in the technical committee had influence on Guarding Minds at Work. So they chimed in and said what they thought the improvements should be, and we took that to heart, and it's being updated as we speak.
And do you see, like, there is a disruption in the workplace right now because of COVID-19? But technology and this macro disruption is happening. Where does the standard fit in there? Like, how does the standard apply when technology is really disrupting how we're even communicating? I think the standard, it's up for interpretation, but one interpretation is that it's based a lot on kind of face-to-face communication, some group discussion. When that changes, does the standard change, or is it so universal and timeless that those principles still apply?
Well, it's interesting because the idea that you need to engage employees hasn't changed because technology's come in. In fact, what you and I are doing right now, sitting in different provinces talking and we can see each other, is a way to have a more psychologically safe interaction. I know personally that telephone calls can really go sideways because people don't know how to interpret. Emails can really go sideways because people read meaning in that's not there. But when you and I are talking like this, I can see you. I can see your reaction and you can see mine, and it is psychologically safer. But the whole idea of change is the new constant means that we have to spend more time on psychological health and safety than we did in the assembly line type environment. Because at that point, if people know what to expect and they're just doing the same thing over and over again, there's much less opportunity for people to be triggered, for people to be stressed, for people to um, have conflict, because your head's down, you're focused on what you're doing. So I think the standard is going to be needed more in the future workplace than it did before. And I can't tell you who said this, and I'm sorry about that, but they said, we used to work with our muscles, now we work with our brains, soon we're going to work with our hearts. And as AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning replaces a lot of our um, concrete linear thinking, it really is going to be the connection to people, the empathy that we have, the ability to read people and respond, that will be paid for because it's what we offer that machines don't.
That's a really interesting take, and I think we're starting to see some of that because we, you know, the whenever I do a quick talk in big workplaces, I often start with something to the effect of like, look, if I was here in the 1980s, 1970s, we'd be talking about like MSK, musculoskeletal injuries, or head injuries, or just like real physical things because the work was so physical. And now we see so much breakdown in the emotional side. My estimation of that is because we're taxed much more emotionally and definitely taxed more cognitively, the way our workplace is structured today. And potentially the machines can replace the cognitive, but they can't get the emotional side right yet.
No, and even the cognitive, very straightforward thinking,
Sure.
but machines still aren't as creative, as innovative, as agile as our best thinkers are. And so there's a lot of that to consider. I'm not really afraid that AI can replace us, but I do think that all of us need to think about using technology to support us to do our best work rather than to replace us.
Absolutely. And are those conversations happening with the folks that, you know, have designed the standard, like where machine learning is taking this and where AI is taking this and emotional intelligence? Is that on the horizon for the folks that make that authoritative document?
I'm sure it'll come up in conversation. We're going to meet again in June. We do this every year just to say what everybody sees, because most of us represent a constituency. We're not just individuals coming to the table, but we're part of communities of practice, whether it's professional or it's sectors. And we come back to share, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're hearing. And yet, when I think about the standard and I think about technology, I'm not sure any of it changes anything. We were talking recently about the fact that I think it's clause 4.4.1
That's the clause.
says that if you are leading people or managing them or supporting them, that you ought to be competent to do it in a psychologically safe way. And I mean, when that was written, that's revolutionary, because most of our leaders are technically or strategically astute, and they weren't necessarily trained how to protect the psychological safety of employees. But the standard now says that should be a given. And so we're really looking at how do we help that to happen? Because we don't want to fire every leader that exists that doesn't have that skill set. We want to support them to develop it. And so Dr. Jody Samra created the Psychologically Safe Leader Assessment, where it's not about, are you a nice person? Are you touchy-feely? Or even, do you have high levels of emotional intelligence? It's really, here's leadership strategies that support the standard. And how many of these are you doing, to what extent? And if you're not, why not? And why not think about adopting them? So we're really trying to help those leaders that they're not touchy-feely. That's not who they are. And yet they don't want to do any harm either.
That's very interesting. That part of it is, well, the exclusion of emotional intelligence, because you would think that that'd be a cornerstone to being to providing a psychologically safe workplace.
But you would know that sociopaths can have high levels of emotional intelligence, right? They know how to manipulate people.
Sure.
Yeah. And so emotional intelligence on its own does not a great leader make. What makes a great leader is not how they test out, but how they behave. How do they act when they're stressed, when they're overwhelmed, when they're pressured? How do they respond when their employees are stressed, overwhelmed, or pressured? That's really the sort of core of good leadership. And yet we're testing less for that and more for, can you score high on emotional intelligence? Well, lots of people can that aren't great leaders.
Yeah, and it's more about the behaviors, the actionables, which I like. I think that's probably where the evolution of things is. We always say, the bell has been rung. It's kind of a play on the bell, let's talk thing. So the stigma has been reduced. What are the actionables that leaders can take now? Yeah, no problem. What are the actionables that leaders can take? And I think the more concrete and simple that we can make that, not simple because we're dealing with highly intelligent people, simple because this is a complex issue. Like the standard has a 62-point checklist. That's a lot of checkpoints to check off for an organization. Where do you see the standard falling short? What has it not been able to do that you wanted it to do? If you had to critique it, where would you go with that? What are the things that it hasn't achieved that you wanted it to?
Well, I don't think that standard in and of itself can change attitudes, but I always say, let's change the behaviors and the attitudes will follow. When you think about civil rights, when you think about women's rights, we didn't change people's minds about that to begin with. We forced them to change their behaviors, and then the attitudes came. I always think, I have people who say to me, well, that's just who I am. And I say, no, it's not. That's just what you do. And this is the way I look at it in the workplace, is we can choose to hold people accountable for behaviors that are psychologically safer until they start to adopt the right attitudes. Where this standard may fall short is it's too complex for many organizations, and they're not sure how to embed it in the way they do business. And so they start this great big side project that's overwhelming. And I say, no, don't. Just look at what your organizational goals are. And I use the example, some people, their organizational goal is increase sales. That's the only thing that matters to them because they're fighting for their survival. And you think, well, you know, if that's what it is, then they don't have room for this. And I disagree, because when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's directly correlated in the research to increase in sales. So we say, great, let's take your sales department, let's increase their emotional intelligence, where what we're really doing is helping them also to interact with each other better, as well as with clients. And we are improving psychological health and safety and meeting the organizational goals. So I just think a lot of the things with the standard is when someone just looks at a document, they can be overwhelmed with it, even though it's really only 15 pages of standard, but it looks overwhelming. There's lots of words. It's written in legalese.
Sure.
But so I think that's the drawback, is when people don't really think about the outcomes. They just think about the process.
That's something I've heard, and for employers, I don't know if you've had this experience where they look at the standard, they feel or think, I'm confusing those two, but think it's a compliance document, and then they're like, oh shit, we got to like do a bunch of work to implement this thing. Let's bring in a consultant. Let's have a whole wellness committee committed to it. And I think it gets lost in the shuffle, like creating the perfection of it. It gets lost as to what the actual spirit of the standard is, which is really to get started to implement something, work toward your company goals. How do you message that to organizations to say, look, this is not law. You are not going to get punished if you don't check off all 62 boxes?
Well, that's why I usually start by going to the organization and saying, what are your strategic goals? What is it that your organization's trying to do right now? And then I take that away after I've really said, why are these your goals? What are the challenges to reaching them? You know, what is the benefit of reaching them? And I understand where they're at. Then I can go away and I can come up with approaches that really help them meet the goals they're trying to meet anyways. And it takes away a lot of that stress. And I say, the standard is just over here where you're saying, okay, I'm going to do this because it's good for my organization. And yeah, I can check off a few boxes, and next year I'll check off a few more. But while I'm busy trying to keep my business sustainable, let's find the psychological health and safety strategies that support that. Because you know what's really bad for our mental health? Being unemployed. So we don't want organizations to risk their sustainability by launching a huge, expensive initiative. It's not necessary. Just simply start to require your leaders to report on how they support psychological health and safety. Make that part of the recognition and reward for them. Then ask the question, with everything you're doing, how might this impact psychological health and safety? And those two things alone can revolutionize a workplace.
It seems really simple, and the resources are often free, and the uptake is good, but not as holistic or widespread as it could be. And there was at one time a very conscious thought to make these resources free, and that could benefit uptake. That could be a detriment to uptake. People may not see them as valuable. Take me through that thought process when that was happening.
So at Workplace Strategies for Mental Health, we create really hundreds of free resources that can help on that journey to psychological health and safety. But most people in the workplace are too busy. They need consultants like yourself. They need someone to hold their hand and to walk them through it. And that's great. And that goes back to you and I saying, do we want to discourage people? Do we want to say, no, don't get into this field? And I think, no, employers, even though resources are free, employers don't have the time to put the effort in to read and understand them and then implement them. So these consultants, like yourself, are that bridge to helping employers walk through this in a way that's cost effective and time effective.
And I've seen too a movement of like large companies hiring a mental wellness coordinator. In the energy and gas sector, I would think most large companies, for sure the top 10 in this part of the world, all the big banks have a mental health dedicated person. And I think that's excellent to see. That's something we didn't see 10, 15 years ago. How are you finding working with those individuals and the advantages of that?
So often the mental wellness person is relegated to individual employees' mental health, which is a great thing, but it doesn't change the way leadership is behaving. It doesn't change the way work is assigned. It doesn't change the stress and the demands in the workplace. In most cases, it is only pushed out to employees, and it doesn't affect the workplace itself. It's not changing the way we interact, the way teams discuss issues. And so I think mental wellness is great, but the organization has a responsibility to look at itself as well.
Do you think this is like we see a lot of large organizations implementing the standard and they have the wellness coordinator who can assist with that. They might have the spend to pull in a consultant to help facilitate starting the standard. Small businesses, I think there's a gap there. Even medium businesses, when you're looking at like I have 200 to 500 people, they have an HR person. In my experience, that HR, our people and culture director, does everything from benefits to health, to physical health, to wellness, to disability, to like payroll. Like they're strung out. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that's a real pain point. And I wonder if if there's considerations for the standard of how to do it for a small business where you don't have the people power to carry out an initiative.
Yeah, in the annex of the standard, there's actually a scenario of somebody who owns, I think it's a garage.
I think it's Joe's garage.
That's right, Joe's garage. And really talking about how they might use the standard. There's pros and cons of the size of the organization. In a small organization, the leader doesn't need approvals. They don't need to go through different layers. It's not hard to reach every employee. And so they really can just decide what they want to do, look at what's available, and choose how they want to implement. So from that perspective, it's great. The downside of being a small business owner is it's all on you, right? Yep. You have to do it all. Or if you're a little bit bigger, your HR has to do it all. But when you get into the larger organizations, the idea that you'd have a consistent rollout across a national organization is unrealistic. And for that reason, we say if you're a huge company, you have to look at this as cascading down. So the organization assesses what needs to be done, tells the leaders this is how we're going to measure success, and then gives the leaders some leeway on how they're going to do it with their team. Because you can't use a cookie cutter approach. It may be that your group is really fighting with work-life balance, but my group really has that under control, but we're not as great with civility and respect. You have to allow us to deal with the issues that really are affecting our team. So I always see psychological health and safety not as a big top-down process, but one that has to cascade down with each level sort of embracing it, understanding it, and then owning it, so that the frontline employees not only understand what the goal is to have a psychologically safe workplace for themselves, but take responsibility to contribute to that. Because a leader can stand on their head. They can be the nicest person possible. They can do everything right. But if you got team members who are slamming each other all the time, you are not having a psychologically safe workplace. So everybody has to take responsibility.
We talked a little bit about, the small business, and I think that advice is very practical and well taken. And I see small businesses as a hot spot in terms of where psychological safety, health and safety could fall down. I see another couple of hot spots, like groups who actually don't really want to entertain the conversation for whatever reason. There's a lot of legal groups. I think there's increasing mental health needs, but less of a want to put things in place. What verticals, what industries, what groups, where do you see the hot spots right now with psychological unsafety or difficulty in implementing something like this?
Well, at one point we used to say that it was the blue collar sector,
Sure.
but that's not true
Yeah,
anymore.
I agree.
There's a lot of enlightened people in the blue collar sector who are doing really great work. So I no longer think it's a particular sector. We see some really psychologically healthy and safe educational institutions, healthcare facilities, and we see really bad ones that are not so psychologically safe. So I'm not sure that I can pick a sector now. I know sectors where they're working in concrete, they're doing new construction, and they have each other's backs. So it really can be that way. But I was going to say, that those that are still afraid, they're afraid of opening up a can of worms. They would rather have an environment of fear where people just won't complain than they would wanting to open up should we behave differently. And we have a couple of processes where you can actually come up with a team agreement to be very specific about, this is the way we're going to greet each other, this is the way we're going to deal with conflict, these are the things that are not appropriate. We agree, because it's so different in every workplace. So I'm working with some police right now, and their idea of civility and respect is going to be different than, say, a ballet school. And they should be allowed to create an agreement based on what makes sense for them. And even if there are some people who don't like it, if the terms of interaction are very clear, it's much less likely to be traumatic. You may not like it as much, but it's expected, and therefore it doesn't feel personal. So I think
I like
the
that.
smaller the organization, the easier it is to come up to a psychologically safe interaction agreement.
I think that's excellent, and it sounds straightforward. And I like how you positioned it, because most organizations would say, yeah, it's not cookie cutter. We can't just come up with some blanket statement on it. But I like the rule book, because if you have the rule book, everyone at least knows what to expect.
That's right. And it's unlike the respect in the workplace, which is just a bunch of words, maybe on the wall or in a book, that everybody just rolls their eyes about and nobody really enforces because it's not part of the culture. Whereas when you get your own team to create this together and agree together that this is the way we will interact, we are going to be self-reinforcing, as opposed to something that the organization imposes on us.
I see. Yeah, that's really smart. I really like that. You and I have talked about like burnout and in this industry, you're dealing with a lot of high stress and a lot of emotionally high temperature situations. And I tend to think that the last bastion of stigma is with caregivers, who need to tell themselves and tell others that they're, for lack of a better term, mentally strong enough to take on what everyone else is what's going on with everyone else. So I think there's like a lot of self stigma with people who are taking care of other people, which is why physicians don't always have the best mental health and are the last people to reach out for help. So yeah, that's I guess my opinion on, like, we used to think it was blue collar. I totally agree that it's not. I think it's now the people who are standing up and saying, "I'm a thought leader. I'm a caregiver. I never get mental health issues." I think that's the real last area of stigma that we need to, not the last, but one of the last areas of stigma that we need to go after somehow.
Well, I use a metaphor from gaming, because there's many gamers out there, video gamers, and the idea that, yeah, you can armor up, right? You get wounded by life, by whatever, as a caregiver at your job, and you can armor up, meaning that you can cover up, you can resist it, you can pretend that the wound's not there, and that might be a coping strategy to use in the moment. But then what happens the next time you get wounded? You put on another layer of armor, and then another layer of armor. At what point can't you carry it anymore? But the thing is to heal your wounds, you have to open up. You've got to expose yourself. And I used to, like many people, think vulnerability was weakness. And I now understand the ability to be authentic, the ability to have the courage to say, I'm hurt, I need to heal, is the greatest strength. And we see that with leaders everywhere, and male and female, that the really strongest people can take the time to open up, to heal, so that the rest of their life isn't so weighted down. And I think Dr. William Shafir wrote the book, The Cloak of Competence. And he says so many people go into the medical profession to be a doctor because they care, they want to help. But as soon as they put that coat on, they're supposed to show no fear, show no weakness, show no strain or stress or vulnerability. And the humanity gets sucked out of them, but then this cloak becomes heavier and heavier and heavier, this white coat, because it's shielding all the wounds that they have. And I really think that vulnerability is the new strength, and that more and more people, as I say, male and female, are understanding that, and how much it improves the quality of life.
Have you found that, like, that's so powerful? Have you found that with yourself? I've found you to be a very authentic and at times vulnerable person, and you're one of the true leaders in this space. Have you found that that's, I don't want to say benefited, but helped you connect to the work more? Where have you found the benefit of yourself being vulnerable and authentic? Because you surely have.
Yeah, I say that being in this field feels like I've been in 20 years of therapy and, and good therapy, right? Because as you learn how to help others, as you learn the different modalities and what it takes to deal with, people have dealt with a lot worse than I have in my life. And yet they move forward in a way where they embrace life. They are grateful for what they have. They make real connections. And so it's inspired me. I was very much a self-conscious, shy, reserved person who would never complain about anything, very obedient. That was the way I was raised to be at work. You just do as you're told, you don't question it. And over the years, I've stopped trying to be perfect. Um, or really, I guess more realistically, stopped trying to pretend that I was
Yeah,
perfect.
sure.
And it has opened up my life in a way that it's almost like I'm starting over, because
Wow.
I can make a mistake and I don't mind sharing it with everyone, because I now know we all go through it. Whereas when I was younger, I thought I was the only one that ever screwed up. I thought I was the only one who had all this doubt. And as you get older, you go, get over yourself, kid. Everybody feels like that.
Yeah, that is that's cool to hear. I mean, that journey is that's it's exceptional, and um, it reminds me of something that you said to me at the very end of one of the first conversations we had, which had a very deep impact on me. And you said, "Don't get burnt out, would you?" And man, I thought about it for days and weeks, and I think I reached out to you again, saying just that it just impacted me, um, I felt it, and I wonder how you continue to prevent burnout, given that you're such an in-demand individual and a leader, looked to for so much advice and consult on difficult issues. How do you stay healthy? How do you stay yourself?
First of all, once you actually burn out, which I did in 2004, and it sucks, it's awful. Um, you really decide, to me, it was like I hit a wall. And once I had done that, now I see the wall. I'm right in front of it, and
You
I'll
know where it
pull
is.
back. Right. Because burnout is a complete depletion of energy. So you can still work, you can still go through the motions, but it's like nothing matters, nothing brings joy. You're just pushing on. And it's often people who have great passion, who really put their heart and soul into work, and they don't have good boundaries for mental or physical well being. And what happens is we fold like a house of cards because something happens, and often we blame that something that happened, whether it was a betrayal or disappointment, or we blame that. But in fact, if you look, most of us who burned out have been on that pathway for years. So yeah, there's a straw that broke our back, but um, had we been in a better physical mental shape, we would not have burned out. And all the work that we've done around resilience really points to what makes somebody resilient also prevents burnout. When I look at a lot of the things that make up resilience, I think, oh, I got that, and I'm pretty good at that. But where I really was bad was that to be resilient, you have to be able to both give and receive support. And most of us are great, especially if we're caregiving type roles, we're great at giving support. But I remember saying, I don't want to burden anybody. And, I can do this myself. And somebody said, so you think all the people you support are a burden? I said, no, I don't think that. They said, well, how do you feel when they ask you for help? I said, I feel good. Like I feel honored that they trust me. I feel like a valuable human being if I can help them. And they said, why would you deny the people in your life the opportunity to feel that way about you? Why do you keep them at arm's distance? And honestly, I had to shake my head because I never thought of it that way. But my burnout happened because no matter how much demands, how much pressure I had, I wouldn't ask anybody for help. And I crashed. So, and again, I say I crashed. I never missed a day's work, but my life as I knew it was horrible for 3 months. As
Three
I
months.
For 3 months, but there's people that it's for 3 years or more. It's a long road back. So that's why I said it to you. I don't want you to have my experience. And it takes that ability to be honest about, this isn't a good day for me. I'm not focused. I really need to stop this and take a break. And then when I have my energy and my focus back, I'll come back. Whereas before it's just soldier on, push through. You can do this.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely carry that mentality with us, and I felt your care and concern and empathy in that moment, and in a lot of ways the whole country does, because of all the amazing work that you do, and being the godmother of psychological health and safety. So thank you so much for the work you do, and thank you for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. I learned so much every time I sit down and talk to you, and we're really appreciative of every moment you take with us. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Take care.
So thank you to our listeners for joining us today. My name is Ryan Todd, and I am the host of Beyond the Checkbox. If you are an HR, you are a VP of People and Culture, you are a CEO, and you want more mental health in your organization, this is the podcast for you. We were joined today by Ann Baynton, and Ann, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ryan.